Welcome to the Infinite Women podcast. I'm your host, Alison Tyra, and today I'm joined by Cleo O'Callaghan Yeoman and Kate Ferrier, PhD candidates in English literature at the University of Edinburgh, to tell us about Scottish author Susan Edmonstone Ferrier. Kate is also a distant relative of Susan's, so the matching last name is not a coincidence, just in case you were wondering. So, first, would you like to give us an introduction to Ferrier's work?
So Ferrier wrote three novels, so a kind of relatively modest output. The first appeared in 1818, that was titled Marriage. Her second novel was The Inheritance, that was published in 1824. And then her third novel appeared in 1831, and that was Destiny. Fairly spaced out, but they became increasingly financially lucrative. So the first one, I think she got £150 at the time for, but then by the time The Inheritance came out, she was offered £1,000 for copyright by William Blackwood. And then by the time she came around to the third novel, that was 1,700. So she was getting quite a lot of money for them relatively at the time. I don't have comparisons, but like she was successful in that sense. The novels themselves are generally kind of titled under domestic fiction, which essentially means of novels written about women's lives, often having kind of like moral, religious undertones or maybe overtones in some cases, and also with a kind of national slant. So she was writing about kind of Scottish characters, Scottish life, Scottish culture, and British culture more widely, which we can always get to later. So she wasn't the only person doing that in Scotland. Mary Brunton, a kind of sort of another novelist, was doing similar things. So they're kind of grouped together with precursors like Elizabeth Hamilton, another Scottish writer. And then in Ireland, you have people like Maria Edgeworth who are doing similar things. So I guess for wider context, there's a sort of, I guess, critical precedent of situating Ferrier within this broader tradition of women writing about women's lives in moral and religious terms, often with a kind of national interest there as well. The novel at this time in Scotland, so Walter Scott was writing his Waverley novels, which were hugely best-selling, kind of supposedly outsold kind of every other author in the Romantic period. So she was sort of writing at a time when there was a lot of interest in Scottish novels that came up in reviews. There was sort of people were writing about this craze for Scotch novels. So Ferrier was, I guess, writing novels at a good time for the novel in Scotland, but Edinburgh as well was this sort of, the centre of kind of British literary culture. So she was kind of well placed in that sense. And if we think about Scott as the kind of the centre of the novel in Scotland, then at the time, sort of contemporary reviewers were talking about secondary Scottish novelists. So Ferrier was included there, which kind of, I don't know, sounds a bit derogatory, I guess, but I think, she was being counted alongside other people who were seen as influential, like John Galt, James Hogg. Blackwood's also had an Edinburgh magazine, which was again hugely influential. A lot of the male authors that Blackwood's published would write for the magazine. Ferrier didn't, but she obviously got paid quite a lot of money for her second novel. And the third novel actually was published by Robert Cadell, so she went elsewhere for that.
Now, it's interesting that you have mentioned that it was sort of slotted into this domestic literature genre, because I find that often anything that is made predominantly by and for women gets minimized, right? Like it's sort of dismissed and diminished. So it's interesting when you're saying like she was the only woman like being published among all these male literary giants with that company. So where does she fit in that paradigm of a woman writing for women, but also getting paid a lot of money and hopefully being taken somewhat seriously at least?
Yeah, I think that's an important question. Kind of touched on the idea that she's sitting within this wider tradition. So, sort of earlier novelists, people like Frances Burney, were sort of highly influential female novelists. I guess there's a sense that, in Scotland, Ferrier was kind of the first sort of significant woman to be doing this. I agree. Yeah, I definitely agree with the point. There's a sense that sometimes things that are written by women for women can be kind of reduced in that sense, or kind of, I don't know what the right word is, pigeonholed maybe. I guess there's an important contextual point there as well, though, the sense that the novel was seen as a kind of female genre. So it was sort of, and it was sort of the thing that women went to write, in a way that men would be sort of writing and reading about history or politics or philosophy or that kind of thing. So the novel was in that sense a sort of a female genre. And I guess within the immediate field of this period of Scottish literature, a lot of the sort of most influential critical work has sort of thought about, Scott popularized the novel to a kind of unprecedented extent, but he was taking on a feminized genre in that sense. So Scott made the novel kind of more acceptable in that sense, with, the assumption being that it was previously seen as something that women were mainly interested in and that women wrote a lot of.
That thing that you picked up there in that Ferrier is sort of this lone voice in this kind of sea of male authors. I think that's something quite specific, particularly in Scottish literary history, to Ferrier, because she's kind of in this sort of liminal space where she, in the bigger context of sort of women's literary history, has definitely been sort of overlooked, and certainly in the public imagination been sort of overlooked. But I think she's also been remembered more than some of the women around her.
Mm.
And so she's always kind of been caught up, particularly in sort of late Victorian and 20th century, early 20th century discussions about some of these sort of big sort of male figureheads. So, like Cleo was saying, like Walter Scott, and sort of, and then Ferrier gets grouped in with them as kind of, and then she gets sort of depicted as this, lone voice in this sort of very masculine literary culture, which in one sense was true. Like Edinburgh did have a very inherently masculine literary culture in the early 19th century, especially with the close ties to sort of the professional sort of institutions in Edinburgh and sort of the Enlightenment legacy. But then actually recent work has begun to uncover a whole host of Scottish women who were writing around her, and sort of making their way sort of in the semi-public sphere and sort of managing to create professional sort of public authorial identities for themselves, sort of alongside Ferrier. So that kind of depiction of her as the lone voice is sort of quite misleading. But just the way in which, Scottish literary history has been sort of told to us or collated down the line is that's sort of the image that comes across. And also the other thing about sort of being professional, and you were saying about sort of, earning money for her work. I think the interesting conversation there is that Ferrier maybe wasn't professional in the sense that she relied on her money. So I think maybe there's sort of, you certainly see sort of more controversy or more tension around the women who are sort of openly being like, I need to earn this money, and writing is becoming more of like a trade that they sort of have to engage in. Whereas I feel like Ferrier, she wasn't rich by any means. She came from a professional family, a hardworking family, and she was pretty frugal throughout her life. But at the same time, she was sort of comfortable and cared for in that sense. So she never had to sort of go out there and really sort of, I suppose, get her hands dirty in that way, in that she really needed that money and those earnings from her novels. So I think that sort of puts her in a little bit of a different category again. But that's not to say that she wasn't invested in the sort of success, the commercial success, the critical success of her novels. So yeah.
So we're touching on a bunch of different things here. So there's a bit of a classism element that in what you're describing, there's the only woman in the room trope in terms of how she was presented. But of course, there's never just one woman. Like that's actually the root of the project name for Infinite Women is so often we get presented with one woman or maybe like, a group of women, but there's never just that small number of women. What I also took away from what Cleo was saying is that there is a larger trend where when you have a female dominated field and then men start coming in, the field itself is elevated, whether that's like a genre or a whole industry. There's this idea that, like, well, when the men come in, it's a real thing that people do now, not just like, a woman's hobby or unskilled labor or whatever the case may be. So, just from what you've been saying the last few minutes, there's so many patterns that we do see repeating throughout history and today.
One thing that did come to mind when you were talking about yeah, kind of like men coming into the field and that kind of thing. I would say, I think at the time, it was very obvious that Ferrier and some of her contemporaries were doing very different things to someone like Scott. And that is, to give him his dues, that is something that Scott kind of reflected on himself. But he also was very public in praising Ferrier and also some of her precursors, so Elizabeth Hamilton. He sort of singles out alongside, I think it's Anne Grant at the end of his first novel, Waverley, as kind of like, other Scottish women who've kind of been doing something that's a little bit similar to him. With Ferrier, he identifies that she is doing something different, but that she's also kind of, she's contributing to this flourishing kind of Scottish literary field. I guess as readers, we could reflect on the fact that, they're doing different things. Sometimes that's a gendered thing. And certainly these ideas are intrinsic to the history of the novel. But I guess it's good just to acknowledge as well what the novelists themselves were sort of thinking about each other at the time. Ferrier and Scott were close. He publicly praised her work, but also I guess in such a way that kind of made it easier for her to enter the literary mainstream as well. With the caveat being that she wasn't doing exactly the same thing as Scott, and that was okay.
And so you've given us a bit of insight into her life and the environment in which, she grew up and lived as an adult. But can you tell us more about her biography?
So actually, sort of what Cleo was saying about the sort of association between Ferrier and Scott is a really good place to sort of segue into her biography. But we'll get to that in a minute. So she was born in 1782 and she died in 1854. That's probably a good thing to start with. She was born in what's known as Lady Stairs Close, which if you ever visit Edinburgh, is just off the Royal Mile, and it happens to be where the Writers' Museum is now. So that's where her mother and father lived in a flat at the time. And she then went on to spend the majority of her life sort of either living in or sort of in the neighborhoods around Edinburgh. As I said before, she sort of came from a hardworking sort of professional family. So her mother was the daughter of a farmer who came from the northeast of Scotland. And her father was a lawyer, or what was known then as a writer to the signet. And he would go on to hold quite prominent positions in the Scottish courts during his lifetime. And actually, that's where we get the overlap with Scott, because Ferrier's father held the position of a principal clerk of session. And actually, he held that position alongside Scott for an amount of time. And actually, that's quite an important point, because in Edinburgh at that time, there's a very strong link between those kind of professional institutions of the church and the law and the universities and Scottish intellectual culture. So actually, her father's legal trade actually brought Ferrier and her family into contact with a lot of sort of leading eminent cultural men like Walter Scott. So actually, that relationship with Scott, it was started as a sort of family friendship, but then actually grows into quite a significant sort of intimate, but also creative friendship between Ferrier and Scott, which I think is really interesting, and also one that gets framed quite often as sort of Scott supporting Ferrier and sort of lending her a hand with the publication of her final novel. So he's sort of using his like intellectual stardom to sort of encourage and help her career. But actually, I think the relationship was much more equal. And we see, particularly at the end of Scott's life, sort of really genuine, organic moments of emotional intimacy between them, where I think actually it was a much more reciprocal and equal exchange, both emotionally and creatively, which I think is an important point to make. Yeah, so I think back to Ferrier's family, she sort of came from a very large family. I think she had 6 brothers and 3 surviving sisters. And you kind of get the sense this is sort of a very bustling, entertaining, lively family. But actually, she, in her sort of teenage years and her young adult years, she suffers sort of a series of tragedies. So she loses her mother in 1797. And then she loses, over the following years, she loses 3 of her brothers while they're on deployment with the British Army. And then, of course, during that time, her sisters, who are sort of all older than her, kind of meet their husbands, get married, disperse either across the country or even in some cases across the world. And So it very quickly goes from her being sort of this younger sibling in this family unit to just her and her father. And actually, that's how it remains really until her father's death in 1829. Ferrier remains unmarried. So and she is very loyal, very protected to her father, and she sort of takes takes it as her duty to sort of run his household and sort of care for him. And I think that's something that does become increasingly sort of more difficult, you know, as he gets older and more ailing. She, you know, I'm sure there were moments where she felt, you know, lonely and quite stuck and maybe quite underappreciated, but, you know, she would never admit that, you know, she should be doing anything else. She was sort of quite stoic in that sense.
Do you see that reflected in her writing?
No, it's interesting because actually I think the parental relationship that sort of figures most in her writing is with the mother. Difficult mother-daughter relationships and like adopted mothers or sort of surrogate mothers sometimes have a more sort of positive influence on daughters, but that sort of ties into the whole sort of Ferrier's exploration of female education and upbringing and how and her sort of debate in sort of nature and nurture and sort of what plays more of a part in sort of inner spiritual and moral development of her heroines. So yeah, yeah, it's an interesting question because yeah, actually, no, not really.
Yeah, a lot of the
um,
fathers are actually conspicuously absent, I guess. Like they either
yeah,
die or they're in the picture anymore, or kind of other, you know, like uncles maybe are taking on more sort of fatherly figures when they die too. Or so it's kind of like a yeah, I think it's a kind of noticeably matriarchal kind of um space, her novels. And like her first novel begins with a conversation between one of the main characters and her father, who is clearly kind of not, I suppose, well, I mean, is a product of its time. I guess the conversation is kind of what you'd expect from that kind of conversation in that particular historical moment. But I guess, you know, as modern readers, he's not the model father, I guess, is the sense. So yeah, I don't know, I guess it's interesting thinking about, yeah, biographical reflections.
So she's at home with her dad, loyal daughter, not always happy about it, kind of lonely.
actually around that time, so 1797 is also the first time that she begins traveling with her father. So actually over that kind of decade after she loses her mother, she's obviously, you know, still quite young. So she's with her father a lot and she travels around Britain um, in various instances. But importantly, she also travels to Inverary Castle, which is a castle on the west coast of Scotland and is also the home of one of her father's most prestigious clients. So that's the fifth Duke of Argyll. And I think this is a really formative moment in Ferrier's career. So she sort of gets to this illustrious country seat, and it sort of opens her eyes to the glamorous but also scandalous world of the aristocracy, which is obviously a life that's quite different to her own life back in Edinburgh. And it kind of supplies her with a cast of characters and, for want of a better word, soap opera worthy events, which actually do go on to inform a lot of her satirical novel writing. So actually, that theme of critiquing the sort of upper echelons, maybe for their frivolity or their sort of fecklessness, I suppose, that's kind of present in all of her novels. In one way or another. So it's clearly defines her sort of creative vision. But then also, I think something that gets overlooked is actually Inverary also introduced her to really important creative friendships. So she met Charlotte Clavering there, who's the Duke's granddaughter. Charlotte's a lot younger than her, but they sort of start this really wonderful, organic, witty, literary, creative exchange, sort of through letters and through sort of in-person conversations, we imagine. And it's that kind of uncensored wit and literary discussion which eventually distills in the sort of proposal to write a joint novel. So originally, sort of Clavering sort of comes up with the idea that they should write a book together, and that kind of idea then sort of snowballs, and manuscripts are passed back and forth, and ideas are passed back and forth, and actually that's what eventually culminates in marriage. So you know, right from the beginning, that kind of those sort of creative friendships are sort of essential to her literary production. And actually, what we can now see is that that friendship was operating within a sort of a much wider community of literary women who were all trying to sort of start their careers in novel writing. So there's definitely an ethos of sort of committing to an environment where women can sort of flourish and critique each other's work and read each other's work and provide feedback and sort of help them into print. And I think that's something that very much continues, the 1820s, even where, that's probably the decade of her life that's seen, or her career, that's seen as sort of very much characterized by her waning sociability. Her father's getting a lot older, much more ailing. We can see in her letters that she's spending a lot of time having to look after him, having to stay in with him, and yet she still manages to keep these friendships back in Edinburgh as well with these various women. And actually, these are women who are even more overlooked in literary history than Ferrier. So like we were saying earlier, sort of, she's the lone female voice in the sort of Blackwood circle. That's how sort of critics have seen her. Actually, one of her most influential and close sort of creative friendships was with a novelist called Anne Walker. And Ferrier sort of helps Anne get into publication, or we imagine helps Anne get into publication also with Blackwood, the publisher. So, even sort of the eminent publishers were publishing other women's writing, as it were, and we've sort of only been recognizing Ferrier's.
Do you think that seeking out those friendships may have been a reflection of what you were talking about earlier, where she was used to having all of these inbuilt friends, essentially, used to having a very bustling social circle in her own home, and then that relatively suddenly kind of disappeared? Do you think that she
Yeah.
was looking for found family to replace what she'd lost?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, we don't know loads about Ferrier's sort of very early childhood, but we know from sort of snippets of archival research that definitely especially when her family moved to George Street, which was sort of in Edinburgh's new town and kind of the social and intellectual hub of Edinburgh at that time, that her house would have very much been visited by Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment thinkers, people like Walter Scott and Robert Burns. An extension of that is obviously this like very large family, and we can see like there were other members in her family who sort of, while completely overlooked now, definitely had artistic and even literary interests of their own. So yeah, there was clearly that she was used to sort of operating in that kind of space, and I think then maybe going to Inverary, and that must have been such a low point for her, having just lost her mother, and she was only sort of 14 or 15 at the time, and kind of and in Inverary, I think in sort of a way that a country house could typically be at that time, was very much, just teeming with guests, just a huge variety of guests, and a lot of them literary minded, and putting on sort of things like private theatricals, so sort of conscripting all the guests into putting on plays. There was also like a weekly newspaper which all the guests were contributing to. So obviously she would have been sort of perhaps a bit of a deer in the headlights because she was so young at the time, but it would have given her a taste of that sort of really sort of informal, rich literary sociability, which then she sort of did try to emulate throughout her life, even if her life was at the same time quite restricted and very much grounded in the domestic sort of day-to-day running of her father's household. So yeah.
We need to bring back the we're just going to put on an impromptu tableau vibes.
We do.
I'm going to need more guest rooms though.
So yeah, as I said, she was sort of trying to maintain these connections, but at the same time, definitely the 1820s were a lot more subdued for Ferrier. And then in 1829, she loses her father, which obviously is like a devastating loss for her. They've lived together, they spent her entire life together, but specifically the last like 2 decades sort of living together, just those two. This is also a moment of sort of instability in her health as well. I mean, Ferrier's she's never had great health. She always seems to have something wrong with her, reading her letters. So she's obviously quite fragile in that sense. But actually, sort of from the late 1820s onwards, what we start to notice is that she has very sensitive eyes, and they are sort of very sensitive to light, or very painful when she's in light spaces. So we kind of then sort of get this image of her having to sort of, retreat to darkened rooms and sort of living by the light of a single candle and things. And then at the same time, her religious faith sort of starts to increase and strengthen now as well. Obviously, it's always been there, and it sort of underpins some of the sort of moral visions in her novels. But actually, now she starts to sort of explicitly turn to a more evangelical religious outlook, and actually gets quite invested in the conflicts that are going on in the Scottish church at that time between sort of the evangelical party and the moderate party. But then she turns to sort of charitable causes and philanthropic interests as well. But then there's that tendency to just see her as a sort of lonely, grieving, religious eccentric. But actually, like, there's still, I mean, she doesn't die until 1854. So there's still sort of a quarter of a century left of her life. And it does tend to get written off a little bit by biographers, or sort of people putting together biographical material. And actually, she did try and sort of again maintain these literary friendships, this literary community. And some of the most, I think, moving parts of her letters for me are the way in which friends come in and read to her. And because obviously she finds reading, quite strenuous and writing quite strenuous now. But they'll come in and they'll read by the light of the candle, and she can sit in sort of a dim room and listen to them, and they can have that discussion. And actually, you can see that those discussions are still really fruitful for people, because she makes new friends in these times. And these are people that go on to become literary women, literary hostesses in their own right. So she's still very much a sort of literary luminary, if you like. So yeah, and she also uses her connections as well to try and sort of promote the careers of up and coming writers as well, particularly women writers. So yeah, I think, we've got to hold it in both hands. She definitely was aging, and her health was really not good, but she still had this sort of resilience and this sort of need for literary society, and she was still influencing the lives of women around her.
I'm always curious when we're talking about works that were written so long ago, because obviously something like Jane Austen's novels are very popular even today. But there's a lot of stuff that we miss because we don't have the context for the time that she was living in. And also, societal views change. I think we all know that. So, how well do you think that her works hold up today?
I think they do hold up, and I think the primary reason that they do so is because she is so funny and she has this really vivacious wit that kind of, I mean, I guess kind of like humor is universal. People speaking different languages, if you find the same thing funny, it's kind of unifying. And I think the same thing applies to kind of different temporal contexts. So I think, yeah, Ferrier is known for being a satirical writer. She has this very kind of acerbic wit, but I think an interesting thing is that within her novels, kind of everyone is made fun of, everything is made fun of. So nothing is precisely kind of taken exactly seriously. I think if we're thinking about contemporary readers, she's known for writing a lot about differences between, for example, English and Scottish culture. What do the English and the Scots think about each other? These are questions that still come up today. And I say this as an English person living in Scotland. There are kind of things that we still kind of think about that still kind of provoke people, that people still find kind of vaguely amusing. There's a lot of history there. She was writing about kind of Anglo-Scottish tensions and relations at a time, I guess, when those things were kind of like historically more prevalent. We were coming out of the 18th century where, a lot of difficult times on that front. But nevertheless, there's a humor to it. I think, English characters get made fun of, Scottish characters get made fun of. Neither is better than the other, and they both revealed different things that I guess, on one hand, we're kind of, as readers, we're intended to learn from. Her novels are moralistic, but in her letter with Charlotte Clavering, as Kate was kind of discussing, she does talk about this. I think she has an awareness that novels should be moralistic, and there's an awareness that, if a novel is going to be popular and well reviewed, then it needs to have some kind of moral tone. She does. I mean, I was thinking about this letter the other day. I think it's in maybe 1809 or 1810, so quite a few years before Marriage has been published. But in that, she and Clavering are talking about these plans that they have for this novel that would go on to become Marriage. And in it, she sort of talks about, if this work were to be kind of like sufficiently moralistic, then reviewers would kind of relax of their severity. I think that's a direct quote. And it sort of people would give it to their daughters to read. So I think there's a clear sense she kind of knows what she's doing, and I think that's also kind of what makes her novels enjoyable to read. Obviously, I'm saying this having kind of scrutinized them for the last kind of best part of 4 years. So obviously I'm probably a bit biased, but I do think that, yeah, she kind of, there's a sort of a very kind of measured, targeted kind of sense of humor where she knows exactly kind of who she's making fun of. She knows exactly what her readers will understand in that kind of historical moment. She knows what they'll take away from it. But I do think that they stand up to the test of time. I think they're kind of, they are funny. And I think that's one of the first things that I thought about it when I was reading. I don't know, Kate, do you have things
Yeah, well, I
from
was
here?
just gonna say, yeah, definitely. You've got to read them because they are so funny, and you will actually laugh out loud. Genuinely, and I'm not just I'm not just saying that. She did know that she was, as probably as a female novelist, was going to have to work within a moral framework to some extent with her fiction. But I think, firstly, she's like very funny, and sometimes the humor is to the moral end, to that sort of moral vision that she's trying to create. But sometimes it's just there to be funny and to be enjoyed by the reader. And I think there's something like special in that about Ferrier. She is playful, sort of with us and with her sort of creative writing. Lady Maclaughlan in Marriage Cleo, that sort of the whole arc of the latter part of the novel is about us following Mary in her sort of her love story as it sort of unfolds, and her eventual, spoiler alert, but also not because of the title of the novel, her eventual marriage.
Probably.
And you're trying to think, well, what did Ferrier want us to learn about sort of, how a young woman might conduct herself and the choices that she might make in the marriage market. And yet
Mm.
that's sort of undercut when we realize that sort of one of the most eccentric, ambiguous characters in the novel, Lady Maclaughlan, has kind of had a hand in orchestrating the sort of marriage the entire time. So she's kind of been sort of almost pushing them together for her own reasons, some of which might be moral, some of which might not be. And I find that really interesting that Ferry is sort of being like, yeah, I mean, there are definitely morals here, and in terms of the reviewers and the readers, I could definitely call this sort of a moral piece of fiction. But at the same time, anybody who reads this book solely for the moral, sort of more for them, because actually you can sort of, I think maybe there's a message there about you can do as much self-development and sort of self-growth and sort of think about your education or your children's education as much as you want, but actually sometimes the universe or the people around you are just going to work in ways that sort of change the outcome of your life or of the next few days or whatever. So yeah, there's definitely that sense of playfulness there where, as Cleo was saying, there's definitely that moral framework, but it's sort of undercut in various places by Ferrier so that we don't take it, as seriously as maybe we should do.
Yeah. I'm actually I've just been reminded of when you were talking, there was a review that came out of Ferrier's novels. I think it was 1842, and it was in the Edinburgh Review, which there were two quarterly reviews, the Edinburgh Review and the Quarterly Review, and they were kind of like the really influential kind of, if you reviewed in that, that was good. Needless to say, very few women were reviewed in it. But all three of Ferrier's novels were reviewed in I think it's 1842. In it, the reviewer writes about how Ferrier's novels are really novels. And then he sort of goes on to say, yet these works are really novels, not dramatic sermons in the manner of Coelebs. They are pervaded not too much by the form as by the spirit of religion. So I guess, so Coelebs, for context, was another, Coelebs in Search for a Wife. It was a novel by Hannah More, who was this huge evangelical writer. And I guess, who kind of criticized novels a lot because novels were seen as very bad for everyone, but especially women, because we're susceptible to fiction, of course. And anyway, but then there's this sort of irony in that Hannah More then also wrote novels, but specifically to kind of, to solve the problem, the problem becomes its own solution in that sense. Anyway, so Collabs is this extremely kind of like sort of sermonical, I don't think that's a word, but kind of like, heavy religious kind of work. So I guess the
Dry.
fact yeah, dry. Yes, exactly. So I guess Hannibal was kind of being very serious in a sense about, what that novel was trying to do, that, it's sort of moralizing to the extreme. And so I think it's telling that people at the time were reflecting on Ferrier's works as works that were doing something slightly different. Of course, there are moral undertones, but I suppose she kind of respects readers' intelligence enough to the extent that sort of like we all know that we're meant to be getting something from this, but sometimes, you can also recognize that you're meant to do something better or that it will be better for you if you do it this way, and we choose not to. And I think, most readers can relate to that. And I think Ferrier was very kind of realistic in that sense about she knew that readers would find the characters who are obviously ridiculous or eccentric or kind of not very kind of morally superior. She knew that they would find them the funniest. She presents characters like Mary who were all meant to be more like Shaw, but she also kind of takes Mary down several times. Mary has this very funny English cousin who's always kind of poking fun at her in a kind of endearing way. But I think that idea of not taking things too seriously, in Kate, you used the term soap opera earlier, which I think is apt, particularly if we're thinking about the ways in which Ferrier's novels might be read and enjoyed by readers today. There is a kind of soap operatic capacity, I think, where everyone's making fun of each other. In the novels, there's definitely the importance of not taking yourself too seriously, not caring too much about what other people think. There's a prevailing in The Inheritance. The phrase in the eyes of the world comes up all the time to kind of mock characters who are caring too much about what other people think of them. Trying to think what else. In The Inheritance, a strong moral, and the main heroine is essentially told by her then boyfriend, that she shouldn't keep her promise to her cousin, and that ends badly, needless to say. So there are kind of things that you can kind of
Innately human lessons, I
yeah.
think. Yeah, not
Yeah.
just sort of like really strict sort of moral lessons that she was targeting sort of her young female readers at the time. There are sort of very universal human lessons that I think everyone can sort of digest and pick up on and challenge or whatever when they're reading them. On the soap opera though, I did just want to say, like, as I think just broadly, obviously we're in a moment now where that kind of period, that Regency or that late Georgian period, is very much in the public imagination, with things like Bridgerton, with the sort of, endless Jane Austen adaptations. Very much looking forward to the new Pride and Prejudice, but yeah, but it would be great if we had, I think various novels also lend themselves to that kind of modern adaptation, or even just to be picked up by modern readers, because like she really does have all the ingredients that those works or period dramas have. There's love, there's heartbreak, there's friendship betrayal, there's family disputes, there's blackmail, there's mysterious figures, there's funny characters, and then obviously you've got the fact that they're set in Scotland, Outlander and things. That's in the public imagination as well. So she's got sort of Scottish castles, but she's also got the English ton, so the ton of Bath, the ton of London. So I don't know. Watch this space. We need we
Well, the
need
new
more
series of
people.
Bridgerton, yeah, they keep going on about, they keep flagging Scotland in the most recent
Yeah,
series. So I just think,
yeah.
let's see.
So if you want to have a sort of funny fictional insight into sort of women's life in Scotland at the same time, roughly, as sort of Bridgerton and things, then definitely Ferrier's books are the ones to pick up.
So in December 2017, a Scottish author named Val McDermid commented in The Observer that she wanted to revive the memory of Ferrier as Scotland's Jane Austen. And I think, as we've just been discussing, that's not too far off. Like, that is a thing that movie producers should be considering. But until we get a Netflix series, what do you see her legacy being in Scotland today?
Well, I guess the reality is today she's not super well known. Most people don't really know who she is. A lot of Scottish people don't know who she is. They don't read her. But she's not kind of canonical in the sense that she appears on big kind of survey courses at undergraduate level, for example. There's an irony, I think, in the fact that she's born, as you were saying, Kate, actually, where Ferry was born in Edinburgh is right next to the Writers' Museum, which only talks about three Scottish male writers. I think it's Scott Burns and Stevenson, which is great, of course, but it's kind of awkward that that's literally where Ferry was born. Something that Kate and I we've been talking a lot about recently is, I guess, how you kind of best navigate talking about someone who is perceived as being forgotten, but like then to what extent does you always talking about them being forgotten just kind of perpetuate that cycle as opposed to actually rehabilitating them within a sort of critical literary canon space? I think it's certainly not true to say that no one writes about Ferrier in academic terms. I mean, we're both doing our PhDs, projects that encompass Ferrier quite centrally, it certainly wouldn't be fair or true to say that she doesn't appear within sort of critical interpretations of Scottish literature during the period in which she was writing. But I do think that more attention could be paid to. I mean, I guess in terms of if we're thinking about legacy, something really good that happened was in 2020, ASLS, which is the Association for Scottish Literary Studies, published a new version of Marriage. It looks appealing. It looks kind of like, as one might imagine, oh, we both have it. That kind of Regency that Regency aesthetic. So, and that was edited by the late Dorothy Macmillan. It's a really important piece of scholarship. It traces a lot of Ferrier's kind of literary and publishing history in ways that haven't been done to that same extent. But it's also available in local Waterstones. So, I mean, it's not true to say that Ferrier isn't there if you know where to find her or if you're looking. I would say that her other two novels haven't received the kind of same. There is an edition of The Inheritance, edited. I think that came out sort of 2009. That is an introduction by Ronnie Young, which is a great resource, but I guess there isn't a sort of a huge kind of big critical edition of all three novels that people like Scott or literally any other male author has. There is burgeoning interest in her. You can get Marriage as a paperback in Waterstones. I don't think she's invisible, but I don't think she is mainstream in the way that Austen is, of course. What Val McDermid said about Ferrier being the Scottish Jane Austen, I think that's definitely like how people might kind of begin to engage with her today. In her own period, she was also perceived, there was this sense that I think it was Ferrier's great nephew who wrote a review of her novels after she died. I think this came out in like 1878. But in it, he writes that Ferrier kind of did for Scotland what Austen and Edgeworth have respectively done for England and Ireland. So there was a sense that those comparisons were there. In the 19th century, again, though, I think it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, I suppose framing her as sort of someone who is like Austen means that she's more, maybe she's more accessible in that sense because people have a sense of what they think Austen does. So Ferrier's doing something similar, and that's true, and that's great. But then I guess as well, in their own period, Ferrier was a lot better known than Austen. She was more popular than Austen. But then, of course, those tables turned. Today, everyone knows who Austen is. Very few people know who Ferrier is. So there's a kind of, the idea that sometimes what makes you more accessible, more relatable, can also kind of make you more invisible. I think it's useful for setting up a kind of entry point for Ferrier. But then I think also history has shown that sometimes too much comparison with Austen means that you get completely eclipsed from the shadow of her own popularity, which is maybe inevitable. Ways of framing things to make them more accessible, but then I guess kind of thinking about the broader repercussions in terms of literary reputation of those comparisons can sometimes be slightly effacing.
I think that's definitely true that while Ferrier's definitely been forgotten, definitely in the public imagination and to a large extent the critical imagination as well, or the critical conversation as well. But she hasn't fared nearly as badly as some of her contemporaries. And I think, like Cleo said, sometimes if we just keep bringing her up as sort of a neglected author, particularly, I suppose, within sort of British literature or within Scottish literature, actually we do sort of a disservice to all the other women who were, because if we can't remember Ferrier, like how do we start to remember all the many women who were working around her? And actually I think like my research looks at various literary networks, like I was saying, so sort of that community of women and men who were working around her. And actually there's so many really interesting obscure women who, like, what do you call them if Ferrier's forgotten? Or what, they're just sort of obliterated out of history. So yeah, there is a time where we just need to be like, no, Ferrier was who she is. She's a complex pioneering writer in her own right, and now who are the forgotten women working around her, sort of thing. But yeah, it's difficult because at the same time in the public imagination we do need to use sort of keywords like forgotten women writer, or the Scottish Jane Austen to sort of incite interest, as it were. But what I would say is that, as Cleo again was saying with sort of the edition, Dorothy Macmillan's edition, we can sort of engage with Ferrier's life and her published writings in ways that we can't with other women writers. So that the tools are there to recover her fully and in more complex ways. So I mean, if you go to Edinburgh, or you happen to live there, you can walk past her house where she lived on George Street. It's a hotel now, and you can have a drink there, but it might cost you quite a lot. So I don't know. You can go and find her house in Morningside, which is sort of where she would have spent her summers with her father. It's got a plaque outside. As Cleo said, you can go to Lady Stairs Close off the Royal Mile. Her a marble bust of her death mask, which is a slightly grim in some ways, but also fascinating in others. But it's in the main foyer of the National Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh, which is a beautiful building anyway. But and it's alongside sort of Walter Scott and I think Robert Burns. So she's right up there next to these sort of eminent men. And her grave, that's in St Cuthbert, so that's right under the or in the shadow of Edinburgh Castle. So yeah, you can almost have like a Ferrier themed tour around Edinburgh. There's two sort of biographical, not full biographies, but definitely sort of giving an extensive amount of biographical material on her. I'm not sure they're in publication now, but you can probably find them if you search hard enough. And then like Cleo said, the critical edition of Marriage by Dorothy Macmillan, which obviously has like a gorgeous pink and blue cover and looks very appealing to modern readers. So yeah, like she's there to be remembered. We just have to do the remembering.
Now, as you mentioned, both of you are doing PhD work that does include Ferrier, and I'm always curious because obviously that's a lot of work. A PhD is a lot of work for anyone who's not aware. So I'm always curious when somebody is committing that much of their time to studying a particular topic, what was it about Ferrier's story and her work that drew, I mean, both of you to this?
When I first started reading her novels, I did find them extremely funny, which we've said before, but I will say it again because I do think that's what I enjoy about her work so much. The second thing that I found really gratifying about reading her novels are extremely intertextual, which I think so kind of, I mean, we were talking about this idea that her novels put forward sort of huge kind of universal human lessons. It's kind of about people talk about Shakespeare, for example, in very similar ways. It's kind of everyone can relate to Shakespeare because it's sort of like, pride or jealousy or whatever, and we all have these feelings. I don't think it's a massive coincidence that references to and quotations from Shakespeare proliferate across all of Ferrier's novels, but it's not just Shakespeare's. When I was reading her novels for the first time, there are sort of quotations from Othello, which is my favorite Shakespeare play. So I think every reader enjoys being able to read something where things that they've read previously in other works reappear because it's kind of gets your imagination going. It kind of makes you feel that you're engaging with this text in different ways and more nuanced ways.
It feels like you're sharing an inside joke with the author.
Exactly. That's exactly that. And I think that really kind of encapsulates Ferrier really well. We've this kind of like turning and like winking at the camera almost, or sort of like breaking down the fourth wall, which again, I think just comes back to this idea that of course that moralizing works, but you kind of have to take everything with a pinch of salt because otherwise, there's no point in taking it too seriously. And I think, the intertextual references that Ferrier kind of weaves into the narratives are kind of just another example of her doing that. So for me, that's kind of what I really enjoy about her novels because I think it also takes you out of that immediate kind of critical context of, of course I think about Ferrier in context of the history of the novel and Scottish women's writing, all these things. She was kind of participating in another kind of long-standing tradition of writers referencing each other. What does this say about their own reading or their intelligence or kind of, how well read are they? I think she was a very well read individual. She also cites, for example, Adam Smith, the huge Scottish Enlightenment philosopher. She cites him in her novels as well, but she'll just kind of refer to him as a great philosopher once said. So, there the work is being put back on the reader to kind of, say, oh, well, which one's she talking about? And of course, writing in post-Enlightenment Scotland, there are quite a few to pick from. I think you put it really well, and I think she kind of invites readers to share jokes with her, and I think that's what makes her work enjoyable to read.
100%. I always think reading her work, the narrator sets up this dynamic with the reader that you're kind of in a like a gossipy friendship where like you're in the know, so you get to know things about the characters and sort of get insights and sort of have, like you said, sort of these jokes about them that maybe other people or the characters themselves are not included in on. So you do sort of almost have this kind of friendship rapport, which actually I think probably is cultivated in Ferrier's own life. You know, the idea that she had these sort of all these really close organic friendships, sort of those kind of gossipy but also literary exchanges that were happening in her own life definitely sort of influenced and informed how she wrote her novels. And like Cleo said, sort of went into building this kind of narrative voice that feels like you're on side with the narrator, sort of friends with the narrator. I think in terms of how I was drawn to her work, I think obviously, like you mentioned at the beginning, like she is a relation, not direct. So I'm descended from her uncle on her dad's side. So I'm obviously lucky enough to have kept the surname. Her books, or Marriage at least, was on my shelves in my house when I was growing up, which is pretty cool. So I always sort of knew of her, knew about her. That interest grew as I did sort of my undergrad and my master's, and then obviously now I'm here. One of the things that's really moved me, because in my research I get to spend a lot of time with her letters and her life writings, and the actual manuscripts as well, which is really exciting, is just that sort of sense of resilience and finding kind of moments of joy and creativity in what was otherwise quite a sort of quiet, subdued existence. So even in the moment where her and Charlotte are proposing marriage, it's a really lonely, difficult period for both of them. Charlotte's sort of dealing with a national scandal that involves her family. So that's sort of really, yeah, ripped her family unit apart at the roots. Ferrier, like I said, she'd just gone through all these tragedies. She's living alone with her father, sort of really feeling lonely. And that kind of holding on to not only that friendship, but the creativity it sort of offers, was sort of a lifeline for them and a sense of escape. And you can see that even reflected later in her life, you know, when she's struggling to read, she's struggling to write, you know, her eyes are really painful, she's definitely aging and getting more frail, and she still tries to find new ways and different ways to sort of engage in those literary friendships and to help the careers or the literary pursuits of the women around her, and support that. So yeah, I would say that's sort of not what drew me to her, but definitely what I'll take away from her writing.
Join us next time on the Infinite Women podcast, and remember, well-behaved women rarely make history.